Good morning, everybody. How are we today? Good? Good. So, as usual, comments and things save for the end, and I'll get to them then. But there's a lot of lag, so I'll get to it when I get to it. I'll try and remember which story you're talking about when I get there, if I get there. Right. Everything used to be about Brexit. Then everything was about coronavirus. And now it would seem that everything is about BLM. And the protests. And the counter-protests. And, everything else that's going on. Seems like the only good safe bet as a faction to join is dead people. So, let's go with that. I haven't organised the stories today, so you get them as you get them. Lots of countries are starting to come out of lockdown. Some of those countries are in a position to do so, like France or New Zealand or Australia or most places other than Britain or America. But other places that really shouldn't be coming out of lockdown, such as Britain and America, are coming out of lockdown when they really shouldn't, because the disease is still pretty rife in both countries, and people are making a very bold choice to place economics over the safety and welfare of people. And I think part of what's feeding into the protests is that people have been closed in and locked up and unable to do anything, and so they finally feel this capability, I suppose, to lash out and go out to find an excuse. I think the armed protests that were going on earlier were one manifestation of that. And then what happened with Floyd has been another manifestation of that. And then the counterpoint to that has been yet another manifestation of that. Here in the UK, of course, the lockdown has become untenable because Dominic Cummings flouted the rules and got away with it, so no one else feels that there should be any reason why they should follow the rules, and then you get a cascade effect after that. So if the right-wing gun nuts in the States didn't have to follow the rules, why should the left-wing nutters follow the rules? It's human herd behaviour is a hell of a thing. I'd show you a book on it I've got, which is about emergent behaviour, but I think I put it away in the other room in the reference bookshelf. But you often see this in other circumstances, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people will walk by someone in obvious distress or with an injury, but then the moment one person breaks rank and does something, then everyone else does as well. You know, it's almost like a dam breaking. You know, it seems solid, like a little crack, a little bit of water comes through, and then that's enough for the whole thing to collapse. Human behaviour can be a lot like that. So if you just have one person flouting the rules, it can change for everybody else. We shouldn't be going back to anything. I won't say I'm entirely unhappy, because the lifting and restrictions allowed me to go and get my cat's ashes, which was sad but nice to bring him home, because otherwise it would have had to wait there for ages. It also seems to have sped up the postal system, and someone's found a lost package of mine. I don't actually know what it is anymore. It was months ago. It was caught up in the Rona, never arrived. So yeah, we'll find out what happens there. So there's good sides. I think people are adjusting to a sort of lower level of lockdown in some cases. You should be wearing a mask if you're outside. You should be wearing a mask if you're on public transport. You should be trying to maintain distance and so on. At this point, since we've flattened the original curve, maybe that'll be enough to keep it at a sustainable level until we get a vaccine. But who knows? Vaccines probably some way off. And honestly, the coronavirus culture isn't that different to how I live normally, so it's no skin off my nose particularly. The BBC has become somewhat irresponsible in all of this. They're afraid, I think, because the Tories have been threatening their funding. And so we've had instances where like Emily Maitlis did a rather scathing introduction to, I think it was Newsnight, and ended up being disciplined for it. Other people have said things and been disciplined for it. And the BBC is still, compared to a lot of other news organisations, a hell of a lot better. And if the BBC is becoming this bad, you've got to worry, especially in a world where the news has vanished. Everyone gets a news, and that's even if you bother to listen to cable news networks or read noteworthy papers or whatever. So many people are getting their news from other sources, alternative sources like this one, when you probably shouldn't, but at least I'm honest about not knowing what I'm talking about. It being speculative and opinion, you know, that's the shtick of the show. But a lot of people sound off about things they have no idea about. I think Tim Pool set out with noble intentions, but I think he's lost his way too. The pull of money is too strong. Yeah, you have to have considerable testicular fortitude to be unswayed by cashola, or social pressure on the other side of things can be just as powerful. But there's a fairly irresponsible story here saying, could social distancing of less than 2 meters work? They're trying to review that and maybe come up with a way of closing the distance, but it's probably 2 meters is probably the best according to most groups. Some countries have different ideas. They've got 1 meter for China, Denmark, France, Hong Kong, Lithuania, Singapore. Singapore has the thing under control. China kind of has everything under control. Denmark does. And France does. There's a common thread between a lot of these countries, though. I don't know about Lithuania. Hong Kong's the one that stands out separate, I think. But there's a strong cultural conformity in China. There's a strong culture of cooperation and mutual care and mutual aid, doing the right thing in Denmark. In France, this exists to an extent, though not absolutely. If you've been to Paris, you have a somewhat erroneous view of the French, because the people in Paris are very different to everywhere else, much like New Yorkers are different to the majority of the United States, right? Singapore is a soft dictatorship. which takes huge advantage of the culture of conformity that exists in Singapore. So I don't think that necessarily works elsewhere as it would within those countries. The real reason for trying to push for social distancing to be reduced in distance from 2 meters seems to again be economic, because various industrial areas and so on, they use space extremely efficiently. So if you have to have people 2 meters apart, then they may as well not be open at all in some cases, and they're only able to operate at very reduced capacity in other cases. So this is an attempt, this review that has been ordered, that has been commissioned by the Prime Minister, is to try and reduce the amount of distance that's required in order to boost the economy, but by putting people at risk. My brother works industrially. He's got a kid who is high risk, but there was basically no way to avoid going back to work. And this kind of thing places him and his family at greater risk. So you have to worry, I think. And we're going to see a spike, or we have seen a spike 2 weeks after the armed protests. We're going to see another spike, perhaps another week from now, from all these other protests. And then probably a third spike another week after because of all the counter-protests. What is the UK's current coronavirus status? Yeah, our downward trend has flattened out and seems to be on the way up again already. So, yeah, things are not looking particularly grand for anybody. Oops, it's set to top chat. We want live chat. That's better. Right, what's next? Probably more coronavirus. Yeah, okay. Right. How do we go about this? This is the intersection of the two big stories of the moment. So coronavirus and Black Lives Matter. Black and minority ethnic people are more likely to contract and more likely to die from coronavirus in the UK. I don't know about other places. I think there's been a similar report in the US. They're more likely to die from coronavirus. And so there's a great deal of speculation and consideration over why this might be. Some people are completely excluding the possibility of racism. Other people are completely excluding the possibility of anything else other than racism. Now, protests and history notwithstanding, I don't think racism is that huge of a factor, particularly here in the UK. Though as recently as the 80s, it was a huge issue. There are so many other reasons why BAME people would be contracting it more often and dying more often just as a result of contracting it more often. But there are other reasons too. And if we want to drill down and find out whether it actually is racism, you need to account for all of these other factors first. But we're in this weird position in relation to this and to cop shootings and violence in the US and so on, where merely making the attempt to try and discern what is really going on and thereby to expose whether it genuinely is racism or not is seen as racist in and of itself. It's not quite as clear-cut in the US, but here in the UK, BAME people are very much clustered in urban areas. Urban areas have higher population density. In higher population density areas, particularly in tower blocks and so on, which may or may not have recycled air, or people living cheek by jowl, one above another, common, shared, enclosed stairwells and so on, I mean, obviously the risk of infection is higher. But that's going to be higher for poor people, poorer people, whatever their race, and people who live in those areas, whatever their race. It's just the black and minority ethnic group is more often in those areas, is more likely to be poor due to poor social mobility here in the UK, but it's worse in the US, but it's not good. It's not good here either. there were some reports early on in the coronavirus outbreak that there could be a racial component to the disease, that people from certain ethnic backgrounds might be more vulnerable. I haven't seen anything else on that. I don't know whether it's true, but that could explain part of the differential. If people of Asian extraction are more likely to contract and die from it, then that could explain part of this. There are problems with heart disease in the Afro-British community, more commonly than in other communities. Some of this is again to do with poverty, so it's not necessarily racial. But the one real area where I think racial differences make any meaningful difference is at the extreme ends of medicine. Transplants, for example, it helps if you have a racial type match in order to avoid organ rejection, things like that. But this is like the way out stuff. And unfortunately, the truths about those differences get swept up in other people's racist assumptions or other people's anti-racist assumptions, which come from a good place. It leads to less good outcomes. So there are things that are comorbid with COVID that could be pushing up these issues, like heart disease and so on. I mean, many papers and so on are coming out now saying that COVID's more of a cardiovascular disease than a respiratory disease. Causes all manner of blood clots. Someone just underwent a double lung transplant and they took out the COVID infected ones, and the sheer amount of damage is just ludicrous. So there are different prevalences of diseases, there are different prevalences of comorbid conditions, all of which could push it up. So once we account for all of that, and I don't have the statistics and I'm not the guy to do it, but once we account for all of that, whatever's left after you account for all of these other factors, urban living, higher concentration living, there could be cultural factors, there could be increased racial vulnerability, there could be an increased amount of comorbid conditions within certain ethnic communities, either culturally or for other reasons. You have to eliminate all of that before you get down to what could be racism. And there could be the occasional racist or ignorant doctor or whatever else who is encountering these people and not taking them seriously. But that's going to be a very small amount compared to all of these other factors. And you need better data collection. And yet, any skepticism, which is what good science relies upon in order to get accurate information, is being treated as though you were Zeke Heiling outside the Winston Churchill statue. That's not a way to get to the truth. It's not a way to actually solve any problems. But this is the world we live in at the moment, I suppose. Rationality, reason, logic, scientific process has to play second fiddle to other concerns. And it's unfortunate, because if you want to actually solve the issues, you need to know what's actually wrong. We talked about shops reopening. A guy gets killed by police in the States, and we get protests here, and we get statues torn down here. We don't have anything like the same problem, which isn't to say that we don't have problems. But also, I still very much subscribe to the idea that this is not a race issue. This is a class and wealth issue, and if you do drill down into the stats, and I do have enough mathematics to do that, it becomes obvious. And that's even more true here in the UK, I think, because even if you do compensate for the statistics, there is a differential in the States, and it's concentrated in exactly the kind of states in the US that you'd expect, the Deep South, the places that have the biggest history of racism and slave ownership and so on. But here we've got politicians paying lip service, Boris Johnson saying there's still much more we need to do to stop racism. There are racists. I'm not saying there's not racists, but there's a lot of confusion around terms like systemic or endemic racism, which don't mean racism as normal people would understand it. It's hard to get a single explanation of what systemic racism means, but the best way I've had it explained to me is that it's the racialized result of policies and ideas and practices that aren't even necessarily intended to be racist, but the end effect is racist. So it's an emergently racist effect of what's going on. So, say you tighten immigration restrictions, for example. You're applying that as a blanket rule to all immigrants. You're requiring them to make a certain amount of money or have a certain degree of education or whatever. And you're applying that to any and all entrants. But in effect, that is going to necessarily impact the black and minority ethnic community more because a higher proportion of them are immigrants. Educational systems in, say, African countries aren't necessarily as good as elsewhere, depending on the country. Obviously, Africa's a big continent with lots of countries, lots of governments, lots of cultures, and so on in it. So you've made a universal rule, but it's going to disproportionately affect one particular community, and that's going to be experienced by that community as racial bias, even though it's not done on a racial basis. It's a bad example because I'm anti-immigration restrictions as well, but past a sane degree. But it just helps demonstrate the kind of thing that they're talking about. So they don't mean individual people saying, well, bloody darkies, damn the wogs, sort of thing. Then they don't mean that. But that's how many people will receive it when someone's complaining about systemic racism. And I think this is a huge issue for the left, the new left, the pseudo-left, whatever you want to call it. So many of their messages are confused and terrible. And it's because they come from these sort of hothouse echo chambers where everyone's read the pseudo-academic papers and understands the redefinition of terms and so on. But then when they get out into the wild, they're not necessarily received in the way that they're intended. You tell someone they have privilege, they're going to bristle. What the hell are you talking about? I come from a working class background. I've worked for everything I've got. I've had my run-ins with the police. My life is not privileged. What are you saying? I live like the Queen or something? Because that's a case of genuine privilege, right? Because privilege is de jure. But they don't mean that. They mean that you have advantage, or even more accurately, they mean that certain communities have disadvantage. But they don't phrase it that way, and so the communication doesn't take place. Or you say, this country is systemically racist. Most people take that to mean, what, we've got laws that are racist? Just a critical mass of people are racist everywhere? That's not what I experienced. That's not what they mean. Or to take it out of the racial animus, a lot of people like to claim that the tabletop gaming community is somehow exclusionary or racist or sexist or whatever else. And what they mean is that some of them have anecdotal bad experiences, right? But it comes across that they're accusing the entire community of being that, and to be fair, many of them are. But that doesn't jibe with other people's experience, so people bristle against it. Black Lives Matter is not as good of a message as All Lives Matter, and lots of innocent people who don't understand that All Lives Matter was co-opted by the far right will say All Lives Matter and then get their throats jumped down, and that ends up pushing them to the right and making them refuse to engage and refuse to take things seriously. It's a terrible way to go about things. Defund the police when you don't mean defund the police. There's a huge communications issue, and I'm going to probably bang on about that until my face turns blue. But there is racism. It's mostly individual racism, or it's something that most people don't understand to be racism because it's emergent from things that aren't racist decisions, but disproportionately affect communities that are minority ethnic. So how do we navigate this when nobody speaks the same language? Some plain English would help, I think, rather than technical pseudo-academic language, but how likely is that? Not very. So buckle up, We talked about France lifting restrictions. Right, coronavirus seems to be entering a second spike in China, and they're locking down and going back on their kind of biological war footing to deal with it. Beijing has had 36 locally transmitted coronavirus cases, and so there's fears of a second wave happening now in China, which would mean that the rest of us are, a month behind. So we could maybe expect a second major spike within the next month or so. And we don't have the same level of citizen compliance or readiness as China. So I guess be careful, but make the most of the time that you're out of lockdown, because it might not last, depending how severe any second or third waves of the disease are. So yeah, again, buckle up. In more positive news, the Solar Orbiter just made its first close pass of the Sun, close being a relative term, of course, going within 77 million kilometres of the Sun. That qualifies as close in astronomical terms. The satellite called Solo was launched in February, and its mission is to understand the Sun better. So solar cycles, sunspots, flares, all the rest of it. The more we know and understand about the Sun and its cycles and its rotation speed and its magnetic fields and everything else that's involved with the Sun, the better we can predict massive outgassings and so on, and the EM pulses that occasionally come out of the Sun, and which could cripple our entire modern civilization, but probably won't. We've anticipated it this time. There was a solar flare that knocked out the telegraph system back in the early days of the 20th century. But yeah, it's amazing what we can do, and it's a shame that more money isn't being put into space missions to find out more about this universe we all live in, and instead we seem focused on sort of petty local issues. Can't even be bothered to go to Barnard Star to check out the planning applications. Various governments have done handouts and support schemes and so on. I got a bit of money from the government as I'm self-employed, but a lot of people have been falling through the gaps for one reason or another, which always happens when these kind of schemes are set up hastily as they were supposed to have been set up. I think rather than furlough and grants, taxable grants at that, they probably should have just done a basic income and just said, okay, everybody gets a little bit of money to help them past all of this. But Tory government, they're constitutionally incapable of doing anything sort of sensible, sane, or universal. It's a miracle we got any help at all. So one probably shouldn't grumble. But yeah, a lot of people, particularly a lot of self-employed people or contract workers, have fallen through the gaps here, and they're stuck. So if you can help out people who haven't been able to get help, I would say do so. Luckily, I got some help. So, but yeah, be aware that rushed change is rarely good change, and that's a fairly universal rule. In lighter news, a company has an algorithm that spots female orgasms. That seems like a very useful application to me. But they have a system that can essentially validate a female orgasm about 90% of the time. So it can spot a female orgasm 90% of the time. God knows how it works. There's not really a lot here. But I guess if you suspect your girlfriend of faking it, you can whip out your phone. Ha ha! You didn't come. It's just so fucking stupid. But there's been outrage about this, obviously, worrying that it's going to create additional pressure on women. If someone can tell how aroused you are because of an app or something, isn't that a good thing? Then you shouldn't have to fake it, And a guy can know when he's doing, or a girl, or all points in between, can know when they're doing well. And this is a useful scientific tool, potentially, for the study of sex, and the female orgasm and so on. I am concerned about potential commercial applications, but surely on a personal and a scientific level, this can only be a good thing. Just I guess watch out for smart dildos that are keeping an eye on you from now on and giving your information back to Chinese companies. Okay, well, let's save that for the end because I want to do a little bit on censorship because there's several stories like that. We found some fossil tracks by a crocodile that ran like an ostrich. Fuck that. Fuck crocstriches. Or ostrodiles, I guess. Better than owlbears. Crocodiles can actually move surprisingly fast anyway. A fact that I learned from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the role-playing game, in fact. But yeah, they can move at a surprising turn. But one that can rear up on its hind legs and run like an ostrich, I'm glad they're extinct. Especially since so many other crocodilians seem to have survived. But they found some tracks. They think they've identified which species it relates to. Or potential new species. And just the idea of sprinting crocodiles. Well, there's a new D&D monster for you, I suppose. We talked about that. Right, okay. I want to do a little mini segment on censorship. So, in the wake of all the BLM stuff, a lot of things are being censored. Little Britain has been temporarily removed from being shown. Gone with the Wind has temporarily been removed from being shown. Fawlty Towers, there's an episode of that's been taken off digital platforms. So I guess the lesson here is buy hard copy and archive it. And the reason for this is various amounts of racial insensitivity in these. Now, you might expect that in older sitcoms or sketch shows or whatever. You might expect there to be a little bit of dodgy racial depiction and so on. But some of this stuff is relatively modern, like Little Britain, where I think they were made in a context that was aware of the connotations and were making fun of people's racial expectations and prejudice in a lot of ways. I wasn't a fan of Little Britain. I haven't watched that one, so I can't comment hugely on that. But even some of the older shows were aware, and they were consciously making fun of racists. So the episode of Fawlty Towers, which is The Germans, which is all about Basil Fawlty's racism and assumptions towards the Germans, and his loss of inhibition after he suffers a head wound. It's not the anti-German stuff that's triggered it, but there is an old guy living at the hotel, the Major, who has grotesquely, cartoonishly racist views and uses a string of racial epithets in the episode. It's not celebrating the Major. It's not celebrating the xenophobia that many British people have and had towards the Germans. It's mocking all of them. And the Major is not intended to be a sympathetic character. He is a horrible racist old duffer. He is the subject of the scorn. And Fawlty Towers is obviously John Cleese. And if you go back to Monty Python, which in many ways was kind of the Beatles of comedy, I suppose, of the era, these were all fairly right-on progressive guys. And yet if you go back and watch some of the old episodes, there are episodes where they're in blackface. And that is making fun of racism. Again, stupidity like the Black and White Minstrel Show, which was still on at that time, or poking fun at American ideas around race. These aren't necessarily the most celebrated sketches, but there's one that's like a a mockery of American films and ideas and the depiction of black people in American films at the time, where one of the Pythons, I forget which one, is in blackface, and he's doing the whole kind of Swanee River, massively hyper exaggerated blackface. Yeah, the forelock tugging, the whole bit. But that's to mock American racism and depictions of black people and the whole idea of blackface. And I think it was quite successful at that. It's not the most hilarious of their sketches, but it's quite funny. So where do you draw the line? Is it that blackface itself is beyond the pale, or does it depend whether it's mocking and replacing black people, or whether it's mocking blackface itself? If we look at Papa Lazarou in The League of Gentlemen, for example, I don't think anyone. Well, no, I'm sure someone can watch that and come away with the idea that the whole show is racist and horrible. But again, the point is the mockery of these ideas, and the sort of petty racism and expectations of the people in small backward communities such as Royston Vasey, you know. And things like Gone with the Wind, I mean, that was it the first black Oscar, or the first black female Oscar was awarded to one of the supporting actresses in that? Yeah, that's an important milestone for minority people. And yet that's being taken away. Why? Because she's playing an underclass figure in an era where black people were the underclass. Yeah, this is a classic film. It's an important cultural milestone, whatever spin you want to put on it. So is it responsible to remove these things? And this also exposes the problem of digital censorship. When everything is in the cloud, it's being stored on someone else's computer, and they can delete it for you at any point. Something you've paid for, something that you at least hypothetically own, can just be stripped away and taken away on a whim. Removed from the public discourse, removed from people's experience, removed from people being able to interact with or see or understand or analyse or study. It's just gone at the click of someone's fingers. Now, I'm sure there are horrible racist people who take the wrong messages from these things, but that doesn't mean it should cease to exist. Book burning, I don't think it doesn't strike me as excusable, save where you can draw a direct line of harm between the publication or the speech or the expression and something happening. So like a pamphlet that encourages everyone to go out and kill someone of a particular type or whatever, something like the Scum Manifesto, or a far-right leaflet saying, you know, go and stab a Muslim or whatever, that would be acceptable to be censored, because you can draw a direct line of harm. But in these cases, you can't, and they're important to understand and analyse. Another aspect of this is the erasure of the line between your personal and professional lives. So, used to be you leave work, you're responsible for yourself. Anything you do or say or whatever doesn't reflect back on the company. But we all live in this social media panopticon. There isn't Big Brother. There's a gang of little sisters ready to tattle on you at any point, right? So we're all under constant surveillance for the slightest thing that we do that can be interpreted the wrong way or the right way, and then that can always get back to where you work and the job that you do. So a guy working for Riot Games reshared a meme about George Floyd. Which just listed all the sort of criminal background of Floyd. I think any reasonable person, so everyone except Candace Owens, understands that no matter what criminal background or his involvement in pornography or whatever else the case might be about Floyd, he didn't deserve to have someone kneel on his neck for 10 minutes and kill him. Right? So this is irrelevant. So it's understandable why posting such a meme or whatever might be considered horrible or abhorrent, but he did it on his own time, outside of work, espousing his own personal views, which he has a right to, however vile they might be. Even said, it doesn't excuse it before the thing, but he still lost his job. Should he have? Would it be untenable for him to remain there if the rest of the office doesn't agree with him and this comes out? Possibly. But I don't think you should be fired for having a bad opinion about anything, really, provided it doesn't influence or affect your work. But companies want to extend control over your life, much like they used to through the old company store, just on social media now. And whoever you are and whatever you do, you're being held accountable by obeying mob that can't agree on anything. If you say something one way, you stand the risk of being fired. If you say something the other way, you stand the risk of being fired, or your online reputation being trashed, so that even if you work for yourself, even if you're kind of above the fray to an extent, you can still end up getting harmed because your reputation becomes tarred, often by something you never said, or people reading dog whistles into something that you never meant. This erasure of the line between public and private life and work life and outside work life is worrisome, and it's just unfortunate that it's incidents like this where I think most people will instinctively, sort of first order thinking, react and say, yeah, that guy shouldn't have said such horrible things, he deserves to be fired. But you've got to think of the wider impact. What if it was someone saying something left-wing and got fired for it? How would you feel about it then? Or what if it was someone fired for saying something supportive of BLM? How would you feel then? And really, in terms of intrusion into people's personal lives, what's the difference? Other than that you agree with one point of view and you disagree with the other. You gotta think about the implications of these things, and then the implications of the implications, to really begin to understand the overall effect that these things are having on our society as a whole, and how they can pose a threat to you, even if you agree with whoever is the target now. So it seems to be a very hard thing to get across to people. There's a few things that didn't make the actual news, but which were interesting, I thought, around digital censorship and so on. So there was a story doing the rounds on Twitter where it kind of led down a rather horrible, nasty rabbit hole. But there's this 16-year-old girl, which is legal here in the UK, but legal to have sex, not legal to appear in pornography or send nude pictures or whatever. There's a 16-year-old girl posting very, very provocative sexualized pictures on Twitter and other social media for clout, and getting a lot of attention from a lot of pervy older men. So this presents an interesting question, particularly from a UK point of view and a freedom of sexual expression point of view. So at 16, you're allowed to fuck, but you're not allowed to pose nude or to appear in pornography. And if you send nudes or whatever else to someone else and you're under 18, both you and they can be prosecuted for peddling underage pornography. This doesn't make a great deal of sense, because lots of teenagers become sexually active pretty early, and everyone's got these devices, and if you're with someone, you may want to share some naughty pictures of each other with each other, and it just makes no sense where it's entirely consensual for anyone to be prosecuted. But this case demonstrates that even beyond that, when we're talking internationally, where ages of consent and so on, and ages at which you can appear in adult material and so on, vary, higher and lower, how the hell do you police this? And what what moral or ethical guidance is there here beyond obviously consent? And to watch Americans react with such visceral and absolute disgust when young adults that in the rest of the world are often considered autonomous individuals, to react to a 17-year-old doing this as though anyone who was interacting anyone who was interacting with them as a paedophile is just it's disorienting, especially for someone who lost their virginity at 15. It just seems odd, but I don't see a way to negotiate this and travel through this, and it's little wonder that people are sexualizing themselves for clout, or for followers, or whatever else, even if they are underage. I mean, Christ, back in the days of VHS, what's her name? There was an adult star whose name escapes me for the moment, who pretended to be 18 and appeared in a lot of movies before she actually turned 18. And this was a huge kerfuffle and problem, and led to a lot of retraction of tapes and films and so on at the time, and magazines and so on. It was a huge hoopla. I wish I could remember her name. It's fairly famous. I'm gonna have to look it up. Got to be careful about these web searches. Tracy Lords. She started when she was underage, possibly even as low as 15. She was cognizant of what she was doing. It's like Melinda Messenger. She appeared topless in the sun, and there was like a countdown to when she was old enough. Things like that. But how do you navigate it? Many kids do have, many young adults do have sufficient autonomy, self-understanding and so on to do this, but we've got to draw a line somewhere legally, because the law is a blunt instrument. And then there's this nebulous area where kids are sending each other pictures where they're both underage, or one is just over and one is just under, and that's being prosecuted as child pornography, which makes no sense to punish these kids or give them a lifelong record. How do you navigate this? Where's the censorship line? And that's real, people. And then, yet again, the issue of lolly art and so on has come up. And what do you do there? It's not a person. The question of consent is irrelevant. There's some evidence that access to childlike pornography may help genuine paedophiles not offend. And then there are all kinds of other arguments about artistic expression and so on. So just because something looks like a child doesn't necessarily mean that it is, particularly when it's a drawing. And again, this goes back around again. As one of the people being upbraided for drawing supposed child pornography online, she was of age, she was using herself as a model for her characters, as well as putting them in sexualized positions, and then getting told off as if she was producing child porn when she was basing her character on herself and her own body type. We just seem so utterly confused around all this, and I certainly don't know a way to cut through it all at all. And this hits pretty close to home because I can't talk about it yet, but I'm involved in an adult-oriented project where one of the people I'm working with is of age but very petite and has a very young-looking body, but is of age and is involved in adult material and so on. So this is kind of on my mind at the moment. And there doesn't seem to be a way to navigate it. Or again, and this is what I find so frustrating. I try to have these conversations. I try to have nuanced conversations. I try to have second and third order impact conversations in a time without nuance, when most people are being extremely reactionary. And we need to talk about these things, especially in an age where pedo has become almost a go-to insult. It's the ultimate irrefutable tarnishing thing that you can sling at someone, but we're at a risk of making that as disempowered as Nazi or racist or misogynist, which have lost meaning over time by overuse. And that will end up only giving cover to genuine predators and so on. These weren't the ways I was expecting the internet to disrupt society, but here we go. Right, don't seem to be many people watching or commenting at the moment, so I guess I'll just toddle off. I know that was a rather dark place to end things, but there you go. Let's see, what am I up to? I finally have all the art for the next couple of Gore adventures, so I'll be laying those out. I've got a job writing short stories on the regular, so I need to start working on those starting next month. So I might as well get some ideas together now. It's nice to have a lot of work, but it's also a bit stressful. And hopefully I can announce secret adult project very soon. Fingers crossed. Playtest kits for Grimdark are almost there. I just need to put together a couple of maps and a kind of quick cheat sheet, and then I can send them out to people. A couple of people have inquired. If you're interested, hit me up. I think that's about it. Take care, everyone. Have a good day. Stay safe. Don't get infected, and don't get killed by any cops or protesters or far-right thugs. Zang.